So we can start. Today, we have the great pleasure and honor to have Dr. Don McClelland in our class. Hello, Tom.
Hi there.
Dr. McClelland is a very active philosopher. He's a lecturer in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. And he's a director of studies at Selwyn College. Is that right? Yeah?
That is right, yeah.
He's dealing with a wide range of research topics, including the philosophy of mind, psychology, and metaphysics. His book titled What is Philosophy of Mind? Is an introduction to the philosophy of mind, of course, and it has recently published by Polite Press. You can find it and order it online if you wish. Also, he has published many interesting papers on affordances, and he has developed the concept of affordances for mental action. This is one of the topics we will have the opportunity to attend to today among the others. And an important remark, Tom is a cat lover. As I noticed, he's partial to cats, so he may help us to understand better how affordances work with cats' minds. Please, Tom, allow me to introduce you my colleagues, Dr. Dimitra Koundaki and Dr. George Kosteletos. Dimitra Koundaki is specialized in animal ethics and animal behavior, and has published a great book about animal ethics in Greek. And she's also teaching in this class with me. And George is specialized in philosophy of mind and philosophy of artificial intelligence, and we are working together in some research programs. Also, I want to introduce to our class, of course, 55 students, all very well and high-level educated, and with deep interest in animal welfare, ethics, and animal minds. So this was a short introduction, and the stage is yours.
Excellent, thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me, and secondly, thank you all for coming today. I've been looking forward to giving this talk. So I am going to be talking about affordances today. I think this is now quite a familiar topic. It's used across all sorts of different...
Excuse me, just make a reminder. Have in mind that we have to close this meeting at 7 o'clock, 5 o'clock your time, because another course is starting after that. So if it's possible, calculate your time and let's have something like about 30 to 40 minutes at the end of the talk for Q&A and discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'll make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion. That's fine. I can always whiz through some bits if I'm going too slow, so that's fine. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about affordances today, and this is a concept that's used across a whole load of different disciplines now. It's quite a common concept to use, but what I want to do is kind of push that concept further than it's normally used. And I don't have clear conclusions about some of the questions I raise in this, but they should be interesting topics for us to discuss. So that's another reason for me to leave plenty of time for discussion. So I'm interested to hear what you think about some of the suggestions that I make. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you. This is Cambridge in the sun. It hasn't been sunny for a long time. That's what it would look like if it were. Bing. Okay, so the scope of affordance perception, that's what I'm interested in. What kinds of affordances do we perceive? And I'm interested in that question, not just in connection with humans like you and me, but also in connection to animals, especially cats, as you'll see. Okay, so before we get to any of the more complicated stuff, I want to do a bit of background about the concept of affordances. So some of this might be familiar, some of it might not be. So you'll probably know that the concept of affordances was introduced in the 1960s by the ecological psychologist James Gibson. So here's a passage where he explains the term. The affordances of the environment, what it offers the animal. The verb to afford is found in the dictionary, but the noun affordance is not. I have made it up. I think we should always do this when we introduce new jargon, by the way, actually make it explicit that we've made up a word. I mean by it something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. So as I said, this is a concept that's proven popular across many different disciplines. So you find it in music theory, anthropology, it's used a lot in design theory. It's used increasingly in AI, some very interesting work there. Neuroscience, cognitive psychology, that's going to come up today. And more in my area of specialism, phenomenology and philosophy of perception. Now, one of the difficulties with this is it means the concept is used in slightly different ways by different theorists, right? So even though it's a useful concept, it is an ambiguous one. So that makes it important to define it with clarity. So that's what I'm going to try and do now. So here's the semi-technical definition of affordances. An object or a situation X affords the act of buying for a subject S if and only if X is a possible target for S's buying. So something affords an action for someone if and only if it's a possible target for that action by that person. So for example, a teapot has the property of being grippable by me. I have a teapot here, I'm never far from a teapot. This affords gripping for me. Okay, it doesn't afford gripping for you, you couldn't reach it, but it does afford gripping for me. I have this ability to grip things, and the teapot is a possible target for my gripping. So I think one useful way of characterizing this is in terms of pairs of dispositions. So here's an example of a pair of dispositional properties. Sugar cubes have the dispositional property of dissolving in tea, and tea has the dispositional property of dissolving sugar. Okay, so those two dispositions are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? They're mutually dependent. You can't really have one without the other. I think something very similar is true for affordances. So we have what are called complementary dispositions. I've got this ability, this dispositional property, of being able to grip certain kinds of objects, given the hands I have and the muscles that I have. And objects have this dispositional property of being grippable by certain types of creature. And those two dispositions are complementary. You can't really have one without the other. That's a good way of understanding what an affordance is. Now, what affords what depends on different subjects. So I said, this teapot affords gripping for me. It doesn't afford gripping for you. You can't reach it. In this image here, the teapot affords gripping for the lady on the left. For the lady on the right, that would be a lot harder. She'd have to get up and walk around the table to grip it. So it's your situation in space, your situation in the environment is important for affordances. But here's another thing that's important, your abilities, right? So this kitten here can be very close to a teapot, but it doesn't have the ability to grip stuff in that way, right? It can touch its paw against the teapot, but it's never going to be able to grasp it, right? It doesn't have opposable thumbs, right? So if I was in the same position as the kitten there, I'd be able to grip the teapot, but the kitten can't because it doesn't have the same abilities as me. So when it's relative to a subject, that's relative to their situation in the environment and the particular capacities that they have. So the concept of affordances, I think, shouldn't be that controversial, right? Obviously, things are grippable, things are edible, things are catchable, things are kickable. That bit really shouldn't be controversial. The controversial bit is the extra thing that Gibson said. Gibson said that these interesting properties are properties that we can directly perceive. So this teapot, for example, it's not just something you perceive as red and as smooth. It's something you perceive as grippable, right? It's not the case that you look at the teapot's shape and color and infer that you're able to grip it. You can see it as grippable by you right here and now. That's built into the contents of your perceptual experience. And I think that's particularly evident in cases where you misperceive an affordance, right? So a ball might seem like it's catchable by you, and it turns out not to be. So that's a case where your perception has misrepresented the world. Your vision says that's catchable and it's a mistake, right? And this is a mistake animals make as well. So this gap looked jumpable for the cat, but sadly it was mistaken. So affordance misperception happens to the best of us. Okay, so far I haven't really gone beyond what Gibson was arguing in the 60s, and people have built on that since. Much later on, about 30 years later, this concept was taken up by cognitive neuroscientists who had a very different approach to Gibson when it came to the methodology of psychology, but did think there was something useful to his concept. And here's why. There's a body of research that suggests that when we perceive an affordance, the motor process of acting on that affordance gets automatically readied or fired up or potentiated. So, for example, when I see the teapot and I see it as grippable, the motor process responsible for me reaching out and gripping it in the very specific way that the handle affords is automatically prepared. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to grip the teapot. It just means that gets automatically prepared. So if I do grip the teapot, I have what you might call a neural head start, right? Things have started already before I've even decided to grasp the teapot. So this was first studied by people like Tucker and Ellis, who interestingly did a study that actually did involve teapots. And they make this observation. They say the visual system is highly integrated with the motor system to the extent that no clear divide exists between what one could call purely visual processing and purely motor processing. So this is a very subtle but important thing to make sense of. Vision and action are intimately connected. So when I'm seeing this teapot, I'm already prompting my motor processes to act in a certain way. Now, there's a very interesting and rare condition that offers us a window onto how potentiation works. And this is a condition called utilization behavior. So this is caused by a specific type of damage to the frontal lobe, sometimes as the result of a stroke. And patients who suffer from this condition are compelled to utilize whatever affordances they see around them. Okay, so if they see a cup, they drink from it even when they're not thirsty. If they see food, they eat it even if they're not hungry. If they see someone else's bed, they'll climb into it and go to bed. Now, there's actually quite a simple explanation for this. Our frontal lobe is responsible for, among other things, inhibiting signals that are going through the rest of our brain. So if you look at a teapot, then this motor signal that would make you reach out and grip the teapot gets fired up, but your frontal lobe can then stop that signal before you actually reach out for something. Often this will happen completely unconsciously, but that's precisely the thing that gets damaged in utilization behavior. So you don't have that ability to inhibit these motor signals. So here's an example of a patient in Japan who was presented with this hairbrush and this toothbrush. And immediately and unprompted, he started using them. Right? So obviously, this one doesn't even have any hair, and yet the brush affords brushing with. So that's what he found himself compulsively doing. And when asked why they were acting on these affordances, people like this patient confabulate, right? They don't have an explanation that makes sense, and yet they're always acting on these affordances around them. So this actually gives us a window onto neurotypical people, right? It must be that when we look at a hairbrush, this action of reaching and brushing gets automatically potentiated. But the thing is, because we have working frontal lobes, that then gets inhibited, right? So you don't even know that that's happened in your motor system. Okay, so that's going to be useful condition for us to look at later on. Okay, so this potentiation, this automatic readying of our motor process is often something that happens unconsciously. But when it's particularly strong, it bubbles up into consciousness, right? We feel the urge to perform the afforded action. So here's an example from Siegel. She talks about soliciting affordances. So this is a special type of affordance where it doesn't just seem like you could act on it. It in some way feels like you must act on it. You feel an urge to act on it. So a cake, for example, solicits the act of eating, says Siegel. Good music solicits the act of dancing. And I think we can describe that experience in terms of potentiation. Like when good music solicits dancing, you kind of feel your muscles getting prepared automatically. You feel the physical urge to dance in response to the music. Okay, so not all affordances are like this. Okay, so I can recognize salad like this as edible, as something I could eat, but I never feel any urge to eat it. I don't have to resist a temptation to eat it. I perceive it as edible, but in a completely neutral way. Whereas other things aren't like that at all. So here's an example. Here is pop superstar Justin Bieber. There's something about his face that just affords slapping. Okay? But it's not just that you could slap him, it's that you might feel a positive urge to slap him. So that's an example of a soliciting affordance in the way that the kale on the left isn't. Now, one interesting thing about the experience of being solicited to act on an affordance is that if you do perform that act, it's effortless. Right? There would be nothing easier than slapping Justin Bieber's face. There would be nothing easier than popping bubble wrap. That's a very tempting affordance. Whereas if you resist a soliciting affordance, it might actually take conscious effort. So I don't have to resist the urge to eat the salad, but I might have to resist the urge to slap Bieber. I might have to physically restrain myself. That's because of that magnitude of solicitation that we experience. Okay, so that's affordances. Now let's put affordances to theoretical use. So there's an analogy that's sometimes used, I think it was introduced by Susan Hurley, which is a view of the mind that's known as the cognition sandwich view. Okay, and here's why it's called that. This is a view of the mind that has three stages. First, you perceive stuff in the world, like teapots or pop stars. And then you think about the world, you think about your environment, you make judgments about it, you work out what you can do, and then you select what to do. And then the end of this cognitive process, the end of this process of thought is an intention to act. And that then triggers a motor process. Okay. So, for example, I can look at all the things on the table in front of me, make a decision that what I want is the tea, and then I initiate the motor process of reaching out to take a sip of tea. So I think this is quite a natural way of thinking about the mind, but it's rightly being challenged. Okay? This is a picture of the mind that is not universally applicable. So focusing on humans for a second, there are plenty of human behaviours that can't naturally be captured by the cognition sandwich model. Often we act in ways that are unreflective. We act in ways where we don't stop and deliberate and think about what we can do and select one action over others. So take the example of the absent-minded driver. So this is a driver who's listening to music, thinking about something else, and yet he's successfully stopping at red lights, overtaking people, performing all sorts of appropriate actions without thinking about them at all, right? So he's perceiving stuff, he's acting, but that cognition stage just seems to be missing. There's no explicit deliberation about what to do. You can also find it in skilled action, such as a pro tennis player. Now, in skilled action, people often act in such a fast way that there's just no time to deliberate about what to do. So the speed at which a tennis player responds to a serve is incredibly fast, and there's simply no time to think about what to do. They don't see the ball coming in and think, right, what I'm going to do is a backhand, and then initiate the motor process of playing a backhand. It's got to be something much quicker than that. So the cognition sandwich model just can't explain this kind of quick, skilled action. Now, things are even more serious when we think about creatures who aren't even able to deliberate about what to do, at least not in a complicated way. So infants act in all sorts of ways, but it's implausible to think that an infant deliberates about which action they should perform. Similarly, animals. So this is my cat Atticus stealing milk from my milk jug. This was an action of his, but it's not like he sat and thought about what to do there. Right? He doesn't have the capacity to deliberate in any complicated way. He doesn't have linguistic capacities. His rationality is limited and perhaps non-existent. But there's an action here. And in neither of these cases can the cognition sandwich model explain these actions. Okay, so let's go back to affordances. This is where affordances are particularly helpful. By appealing to affordances, we can help close the gap between the two sides of the sandwich, between perception and action. And by closing that gap, we can make sense of how cognition isn't always required as an intermediary between perception and action. So you have this perceptual process, which isn't just to do with perceiving shapes and colors. You perceive possibilities for action. And under the right circumstances, doing so can initiate the motor processes that require us to act. In fact, sometimes it can trigger them directly without any involvement from us. So we can detect our opportunities for action without reflection. Okay, so it's not that I see my tea tray and work out which objects are grippable, which objects are drinkable. I can perceive the options right in front of me. So that's one less job for cognition. I can also select what to do without having to deliberate. So that second one might require a bit more explanation. So here's where I like to appeal to a theory known as the affordance competition hypothesis. So now we're familiar with this concept of potentiation. You see a gripping affordance and the act of gripping gets automatically readied. Well, Chiswick and Kalaska have this intriguing model on which we perceive multiple affordances in our environment. So right now there's lots of different things I can act on, pens, cups, and so on. That then leads to the potentiation, the readying of multiple motor signals. So a gripping action's being prepared, a writing action has been prepared, and so on. Now, unconsciously, these different motor signals then compete to be processed further by the brain. Okay? And how that competition goes depends on a whole range of complicated factors, including your habits, including where your attention is directed, what your current goals are, and what your emotional state is, and so on. And depending on those factors, the tea drinking affordance might win over the pen writing affordance or something. So the winner of this competition produces an action, and then I perform the action in question, like drinking tea. Now, the interesting thing about this story is nowhere is deliberation involved. Nowhere do I actually have to stop and think about what to do. My brain has managed to select a sensible action without any explicit reflection by myself. So affordances can help us act without the need for cognition. So the absent-minded driver is acting on the affordances that he sees, right? He sees a red light, which is a braking affordance. A braking motor signal gets potentiated and wins the affordance competition, and he puts his foot down on the brake pedal without ever having to even think about what he's doing. Similarly, Serena Williams acts on a serving affordance or a volleying affordance or a backhanding affordance. An infant can act on an affordance to eat or to drink. And Atticus the cat can act on this affordance, this stealing affordance, stealing milk. Nowhere is deliberation required. The cognition is unnecessary. Okay, so this is a broad strategy for explaining certain types of action. Okay, I hope it applies in those 4 examples I just gave you. But now here's the interesting question I want to focus on. How widely can we apply this kind of explanation? What is the scope of this kind of explanation? And the scope of this kind of explanation depends on the scope of affordance perception. Right? What affordances do we perceive? If we perceive loads of different types of affordances, that gives us loads of different types of action to apply this explanatory framework to. If we only perceive a narrow range of affordances, then this explanatory framework correspondingly has a narrow application. So think of any action that you're able to perform. We can ask this question: do you perceive affordances to perform that action? Okay. So I can juggle, not very well, but I can do it. But I don't think I've ever perceived a juggling affordance. Right? So it's not the case that for every action I'm able to perform, I see affordances to perform that action around. But where I do, then I might be able to explain my actions in the way just described, in terms of reaction to affordances without necessarily the need for explicit deliberation. So there's 2 questions I want to consider. What kinds of affordances do humans perceive? And then what kinds of affordances do non-human animals perceive? So this scope question applies for explaining human action and for explaining the action of other animals. Now, here's my plan. I'm going to cover 3 different interesting types of affordances. Affordances for others, that's things that are afforded to other people but not to you. Affordances for joint action, that's things we can do together. And affordances for mental action. And then I'm going to end by looking at combinations, things such as affordances for joint mental action. Now, I'm going to whiz through a bunch of examples here. I'm not going to build a careful case in favor of each of these. I'm going to introduce a load of different possibilities, and then afterwards we can talk about whether some of them might be implausible. So my plan is it's quite speculative, right? Some of these things I think I can defend quite well. Other ones, it's just a speculation, and it'll be interesting to work out whether it's a speculation that stands up to scrutiny. Okay, so affordances for others is our first topic. So right now you're perceiving a bunch of actions that are afforded to you, a bunch of affordances. Can you also perceive what's afforded to me? James Gibson thought so, right, in the early days of the concept of affordances. He says the child begins, no doubt, by perceiving the affordances of things for her own personal behaviour. She walks and sits and grasps relative to her own legs and body and hands. But she must learn to perceive the affordances of things for other observers as well as for herself. For example, can you see this mug as being grippable by me? So there's a few different lines of argument we can take here. I think the first thing to do is reflect on what our perceptual experience of affordances is like. So this is often quite subjective and difficult to argue about. Your impression might differ from mine on this, but it is a helpful starting point at least. So I think that as well as perceiving a mug as being grippable by me, I can perceive a mug as being grippable by you. And if that's true, I've got to be sensitive to the situations of others, right? Something might be reachable by you, but not reachable by me. Another example might be a ball that's in midair. This ball is headable by these people, but not headable by me. So I've got to be sensitive to the fact that they're in a different location in the environment, which means they have different affordances to me. But it's also got to be sensitive to different abilities, right? So if I was standing where those two people are standing, I could head the ball. Right? There's enough similarity in abilities for that to make sense. But for me to be properly sensitive to affordances for others, I've got to be able to adjust for differences in abilities. So can I perceive the ball here as headable by the figure in red, even though that's not a header that I'm capable of performing, right? I don't have the ability to do an amazing diving header, and yet I can perceive an incoming ball as headable by this skilled football player. Okay, so that's just an appeal to first-person experience. I think in cases like that, sure, we experience these affordances for others, right? But it'd be nice if we could back that up with some empirical evidence. So there's a long-standing set of studies that explore sitting affordances. And in these studies, subjects had a seat that was on a rail, and they had a kind of crank they turned to set the seat to the right level for them. And what experimenters found is that subjects were able to turn the crank to what was actually the optimal level for them before they sat on it. They can kind of perceive the optimal sitting affordance is the idea. And this is meant to be explained in terms of perception of sitting affordances. So for various reasons, the experimenters thought it can't be that people are performing some kind of explicit calculation where they look at the size of their legs and look at the location of the seat and deduce what the optimal height is. It must be perception. Now, since then, other people have run a similar study, but instead of setting the seat for yourself, you set the seat for another individual. Okay, so this was done by Stoffridgen et al. 1999. And subjects were equally good at doing this, right? So perhaps we can explain that in terms of their perception of affordances, but this time it's not something being sit-onable by me, it's something being sit-onable by you. Right? It's this kind of third-person affordance. There's also some other empirical evidence that's relevant here. When we're talking about potentiation, if I see something as grippable by me, then the gripping response gets readied automatically. But what we actually find is that, interestingly, that kind of motor response can be prepared by the perception of affordances for others. So if I'm watching the football and a ball's just in front of the striker for my team, I see the ball as being kickable by them, and the motor process responsible for kicking gets automatically readied in my mind. And you might actually find, if you're intensely involved in some sport, you might find yourself moving in a way that matches what you want the player to do. Right? That's all because of this potentiation by affordances. albeit affordances of a special kind. They aren't affordances for you to act, they're affordances for someone else to act. So this has an interesting connection to so-called mirror neurons, which you might be familiar with. So in this example, there's particular motor neurons that fire when a monkey is grasping a banana. But interestingly, if the monkey sees someone else grasping a banana, those same neurons fire. The exact functional role of these neurons is still contended, but there is a definite link here. Now, interestingly, in utilization behavior, that condition I mentioned early on, patients often imitate the actions of others. So if the doctor scratches their head, then the utilization behavior patient scratches their head. Maybe that's got something to do with affordance perception as well. So you see imitation in infants and animals all the time as well. Yeah, imitations are thought to play an important role in socialization. The ability to imitate is important for gaining those skills. Okay, so we've looked at some kind of first-person considerations and some empirical considerations. But I think this is actually the most interesting one. It's thinking about why we would be able to perceive these affordances. What kind of adaptive value would it have? What kind of function would it serve? And I think it's clear that perceiving affordances for others would be adaptive. So here's what Stoffrogen says in that study I just mentioned. In a developmental context, the ability to perceive affordances for others could be regarded as being highly adaptive for the survival of the human species. So there's all sorts of contexts where it's useful to see something as being reachable by someone else, edible by someone else, hittable by someone else. So let me give you an example. If I can perceive what's afforded to you, then I'm in a better position to predict what you're going to do next. So if I can see that there's delicious cake in front of you that affords eating, well, then I'm in a reasonably good position to predict that you're going to eat something in a minute. So here's an example. If I perceive something as affording running away from for other people, then I can predict that those people are going to run away. Now, it's also useful for understanding someone's current behavior, so not predicting what they're going to do, but understanding what they're doing already. So a lot of the things that people do are quite ambiguous. So when you see people running, it's not immediately clear whether they're running towards something or running away from something. But if I'm able to perceive things as affording running towards by people and as affording running away from by other people, then I'm in a good position to understand why they're running. So in this case, I can think they're not running towards something, they're acting on this runaway affordance, they're running away from an incoming object. So I've been able to disambiguate their ambiguous behavior. I'm also able to act in ways that are informed by others' affordances. So let's say I want to get these people to run away, right? By understanding what would afford running away to them, I can make them run away. I can hurl a large object. So that relates to shaping the environment in a way that will prompt people to act in particular ways. Now, if you think about our evolutionary history, think about how important it will be for adult humans to be able to recognize affordances for infants. What affords eating for an infant? Not the same as what affords eating to them. You give an infant a large, crusty bit of bread or something, they're not going to be able to eat it. You have to be able to perceive what's edible by the infant, and so on. What affords moving on for a young child? Not the same as an adult. If you're perceptually sensitive to that, you're going to be able to look after the infant better. Now, exactly the same considerations apply to non-human animals. So if a non-human animal was to be able to perceive these affordances for others, they'll be in a better position to understand another animal's behavior. So imagine that you're a cat watching this cat in front of you here. You see the cat running away, but running, as I said before, is ambiguous behavior. You know, is this cat running towards something or running away from something? But if you can perceive these little ducklings as affording running away from, well, now you can actually interpret this cat's behavior in a useful way. You can also predict what the animal is going to do next. So let's say you're a cat, it's useful to know what this cat in the image is going to do next. If you perceive those little ducklings as affording running away from for that cat, you'll be in a position to predict that that cat's going to run away before it does, right? And you can imagine how that would confer some kind of adaptational advantage. Also, this cat here might be able to see the food as affording eating to the hen here. So again, it's going to be able to predict what the hen's going to do before it does it. You can also, in these cases, imagine animals acting in ways that are informed by others' affordances. So cats, my cats do this. It is an amazing thing where they know exactly how far you can reach and they dodge it. So when the cat's not interested in affection, I reach down to stroke it, and it's amazing. It manages to dodge my hand by a centimetre completely effortlessly. Cats know when they're grippable. They know when they're within reach, okay, and they can act on those affordances, sometimes at your expense. Think about this in the context of avoiding predators, right? Knowing when you're unreachable by a predator is very important. So my next door neighbor has a dog, and my cats will run away from the dog if they're both on the grass together. But if my cat climbs on top of a shed, if the dog comes, the cat just stays where it is, right? Why? Because it knows that the dog can't get it there, right? It's in some way sensitive to the possibilities of action for the dog. It doesn't involve explicit deliberation, how could it? But it's clearly sensitive to that affordance. So here's another example. It might give the animal the ability to shape the environment in a way that is sensitive to the affordances of other animals. So this video might be too small to see, but it's the very unusual sight of two cats sharing food. So you could say that the cats here are sensitive to affordances for the other cat, right? They're putting the bowl in a position that affords eating from for the other cat. I've never seen a cat behave so nicely. Okay, so I've gone through a bunch of examples there. So we've got at least 3 types of reason for thinking that both humans and non-human animals are able to perceive affordances for others. So let's move on to affordances for joint action. This is quite a similar one, so I think we can make a case for this quite quickly. There are some actions that are not afforded to you as an individual, but are afforded to you in combination with someone else, maybe one other person, maybe a group of other people. So for example, a sofa doesn't afford lifting for me. I can't lift a whole sofa, but it does afford lifting together, right? It affords lifting for 2 people. Whereas my car, for example, does not afford lifting for 2 people. Right? It's not just that I can't lift it, I couldn't lift it with a friend or 2 friends either. Also, think about the kind of situations that arise in team sports, right? There are some things you can perform on your own, right? The ball affords kicking by you, but some of the actions that you perform in a team sport are more collaborative. So maybe we can imagine there's a particular situation on a football pitch that affords a 1-2 movement where you pass it to your teammate who immediately passes it back to you to get around a defensive player. Okay, so perhaps we perceive this situation on the pitch as affording a 1-2 by us. Right? It can't afford a 1-2 by you. As the name suggests, you can't do a 1-2 on your own. But it does afford a 1-2 for the pair of you together. So is there any empirical evidence that would support the claim that this is something that we actually perceive rather than something that we identify in a more slow, deliberative, rational sort of way? Well, there are some studies that suggest as much. So there's a lot of studies into the perception of affordances for passing through something or walking through doors, for example. So if you're walking towards a door or a gap between bits of fence or something, you automatically adjust your movements to fit through that gap, to fit through that aperture. So if you have to turn your shoulders slightly, you perceive that that's what's required and act accordingly, often without realizing. And similarly, if the doorway is too narrow, you don't just walk into it like an idiot. Instead, you stop, right? Because you can perceive that it doesn't afford walking through. There's lots of studies into how this works. There's some interesting further studies. Sorry, that's 2000, not 1999, in which people have examined these walking through affordances for more than one person. So in this study, there's a participant and an actor, someone else, and they have to walk together towards this doorway. What happened? Well, unsurprisingly, the agents automatically adjusted their movement so that they could fit through the doorway together, right? So if the doorway's wide, they just walk through. If the doorway's quite narrow, as they walk through, they adjust their movement and turn so that the pair of them can get through. Also, if the doorway's wide enough to fit one person in, but doesn't afford walking through for the pair together, well, then the participant would stand back and let the other person through first. Or if they're rude, they run ahead and go there ahead of them. Now, the interesting thing about this is it's not just a matter of perceiving what affords walking through for you and perceiving what affords walking through for me and kind of adding them up. And there's an interesting reason for that. If two people are walking through a doorway together, if they turn their shoulders in the right way, they can get through a gap that is less than the sum of a gap that one person could fit through and the sum of the gap and the second person could fit through. I didn't explain that very well, but you get the gist, right? They're sensitive not just to the combination of those two things, but actually to the possibility of a kind of overlap that means that two of you can fit through a door that's less than twice as wide as the minimum that one person could fit through. Okay, so that's some empirical evidence that points to sensitivity to joint action. Let's think about the adaptational value of this again. Now, it's pretty clear that perceiving affordances for joint action would have adaptive value. So here's Davis, who led the study I was just describing. He says, in joint action, successful performance may require that each person can understand and predict the actions of the other, so as to reliably select and execute a response that is appropriate with regard to the shared goal. So in other words, if you and me are out hunting together, we're only going to be able to do it if I'm sensitive to what you can do, that's the perception of affordances for actions for others, and sensitive to what we can do together, okay? And in fact, it's only going to work if you, my co-hunter, can do the same thing. We've got to be sensitive to that, otherwise we're going to end up failing to recognize that there are valuable actions that we could perform together. Or we might end up thinking that there's an action we could perform that's actually impossible, even for two people. And I think this is clearly something that's useful for non-human animals as well, especially pack animals. So you may have seen this incredible footage from a nature documentary a few years ago, where a whole pack of wolves take down a vast wildebeest. Now, the interesting thing about this is there's no way that one wolf can take down a wildebeest. In a fight between a wildebeest and a wolf, the wildebeest will win every time, okay? And in fact, if you have 2 or 3 wolves, the odds are still against you. But in some way, the pack knew that they had a kind of critical mass. There were enough wolves that suddenly this wildebeest did afford hunting and eating in a way that it didn't if there was just 1 or 2 of them. So perhaps that's a sensitivity to an affordance for joint action. There's even more interesting example of this with killer whales. So this might not be visible in the image, but these whales, 3 orcas, are hunting a seal, which they've wounded and which has taken refuge on top of this small piece of ice. And the 3 whales together have stormed towards the ice and created a wave that knocks the seal off. Now, the level of coordination here is absolutely incredible. And perhaps, again, we should explain this in terms of a kind of sensitivity to affordances for joint action. There is no affordance for one orca whale to knock off the seal, but there is an affordance for them to knock over the seal together. And it's a sensitivity to that affordance that allowed them to perform that action. Okay, so we've covered affordances for others and affordances for joint action. Those two are quite similar. Now, this is my favorite one. This is the one I've published on a bit more, and that's affordances for mental action. So there's a whole load of different actions that you perform as an agent. And when we discuss action in psychology or in the philosophy of action, the actions we focus on tend to be bodily actions like walking, eating, gripping, and so on, hunting. But so many of the actions you perform are actually mental actions instead, things we do with our mind rather than our body. So we can reflect, we can deliberate, we can reminisce, imagine, contemplate, attend, calculate, doubt, you name it. whilst listening to this talk, each of you will have performed a huge range of mental actions without necessarily doing anything that interesting with your body. So here's the question: do we perceive affordances to perform mental actions? Do we perceive possibilities for mental action in our environment, just as we perceive affordances for bodily action? So I think there are loads of examples we can give here. I think a distracting object affords attending to, for example. So attending is a mental action, shifting your concentration over to an object. So if you're in a library trying to concentrate on an important philosophical text and there's a bee flying around, I think that bee offers an affordance to attend. In fact, it's a soliciting affordance to attend. You don't just experience it as something that you could attend to, you experience it as something that's positively calling out to be attended to, something that pulls on your attention. Here's another example. Imagine stepping over a sequence of stepping stones across a river. Now, if you do this quite quickly, you'll act on the affordances that you see. Okay, so you can see that this stone affords a left-footed step, this stone affords a right-footed step, this stone affords a kind of lunging leap or something. But then it gets to a really difficult point in the stepping stone sequence, and I think something else is afforded. What's afforded is the act of stopping and rehearsing in imagination what your next step should be. So there, what's afforded is an imaginative act, not a bodily act. And just as our initial actions with the easy stepping stones were guided by affordances for bodily actions, this imaginative action was prompted by your perception of an affordance to imagine a particular thing, an affordance to imagine your next difficult step. Perhaps a fork in the road affords the act of deliberating about what to do next. An old photo album might afford reminiscing. A fantasy novel might afford certain acts of imagination. A place of worship might afford contemplation. A jar of marbles might afford the mental act of counting. And maybe someone raising a good idea affords the mental act of reflecting or evaluating. Some of these might not stand up to scrutiny, but others will. So let me focus on attention. So I think if we think about our experience of the world, I think it is part of our immediate perceptual experience of our environment. Not just that we can grip certain things and drink certain things, but that we can attend to certain things. But another way, we experience things as being available for attention. So think about your experience of a crowd, for example. You can't attend to everything in a crowd at the same time. If you look at a figure in the middle of this crowd, even though your visual experience doesn't really fill in that much detail about the rest of the crowd, you're nevertheless aware of the crowd as available for your attention. You're aware that there's something beyond the thing that you're focusing on. You're aware that there's a bunch of other possible targets for your focal attention. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, we can experience a distracting stimulus like the bee as soliciting attention. So there we actually have this strong potentiation of a shift of attention that results in a felt urge to act on this attentional affordance. Now, there's also some empirical support for this. So attention is obviously something that's studied extensively in psychology. The concept of affordances doesn't come up that much in that literature. But if you look at the literature, it parallels the literature on affordance perception in very interesting ways. And it turns out that when we look at attendable stimuli, it often potentiates shifts of attention towards that stimulus. It readies a shift of attention, even if that shift of attention doesn't occur for some other reason. So you might be familiar with a classic study by Posner, in which subjects were told to fixate on this little black dot, and they're given this instruction: if the dot goes green, look to the left. But then in some trials, this is what happened. Before the dot goes green, a irrelevant distracting stimulus gets flashed, and then the dot goes green. And what Posner found is, if this happens, the shift of your attention to the left is more slow. Okay, why? I think we can explain that in terms of potentiation. Even though you're not meant to be attending to the red star, it affords attending to. And because you perceive it as affording attending to, a shift of attention towards the red star gets automatically readied. And what that means is if you're actually going to shift your attention to the left, it's going to take longer. It's what's known as an interference effect. Conversely, if the red star was on the left here, so the red star flashes up and then the dot goes green, when you look to the left, that'll happen faster than it would do in the absence of the red star. Why? Because something that affords attention has already readied a shift of attention to the left. So in order to actually make that shift once the dot goes green, you have this neural head start, right? It's already halfway there. Now, interestingly, patients who suffer from utilization behavior don't just compulsively, brush and eat and sit. They compulsively attend. If they're walking through the hospital and see a television screen, they stop and fixate on it, and someone has to physically move them to stop them attending to the screen. So if we're explaining all the other behaviors of the utilization behavior patient in terms of this uninhibited response to affordances, surely we've got to do the same for their attentional behavior. Surely that too should be explained in terms of an uninhibited response to attentional affordances. Now think about this from an adaptational perspective again. Why would it be useful to perceive mental affordances? Well, it's useful to perceive bodily affordances because as agents, we always face this challenge of action selection. There are so many actions we can perform, and to succeed in the world, we have to pick a good action, preferably the best action. And that's something that's very difficult to do, particularly if you want to do it in a quick and economical way. But when it comes to mental action, we face exactly the same problem. We face a problem of mental action selection. What should you do now when you're thinking about my argument? Should you subject it to doubts? Should you extrapolate other implications? Should you search for counterexamples? Should you ignore what I'm saying in favor of something else? Right? There's so many different mental actions you can perform right now. And somehow you're selecting one of those mental actions at the expense of others. Now, I think it's pretty clear that it's helpful for us to see our options for attention. Okay. We always face this challenge of where to focus on next. That's incredibly important for succeeding in the world. So being able to perceive a kind of menu of options, a kind of field of possible objects of attention, helps us in this challenge of working out where to attend next. Similarly, in my stepping stone case, it's useful to perceive this imagination affordance. Why? Because if you hadn't perceived it, then maybe you would have just kept on going and fallen in the river because you didn't take the moment to pause and rehearse your next steps in imagination. Or maybe you would have just perceived like a stopping affordance where you do the easy steps and then it gets to a difficult step and you give up and go back. That's not good, right? The good thing to do here is to exploit your imaginative capacities. But you need to exploit those imaginative capacities in the right way at the right time. And the perception of mental affordances offers an interface between your environment and your mental faculties. It offers a way of the environment prompting us to perform particular useful mental actions. And exactly the same applies to animals. So I don't think that animals are capable of the full range of mental actions that we are, but it's pretty clear that they're capable of at least some of them. So, a squirrel, for example, is able to remember things. It can remember where it's buried its nuts. Whether that's an action or not, I'm not sure. That might be controversial. But I think there's interesting cases where it seems like squirrels imagine things. And let me explain why I'd say that. Famously, squirrels are very able to overcome complex and unique obstacle courses, such as the one in the image here. Now, often, if it's a simple obstacle course, the squirrel sees it for the first time and they just act on all these affordances in front of them and get to the food very quickly. But one thing I've seen footage of, when the obstacle course is changed in some way to make it even more difficult, the squirrel starts and then it stops and just stares at the obstacle course for a while. And then a minute later, it then does it and it gets it right first time. What's going on? Well, it's pretty plausible to think it's acting in much the same way as a human would. It's recognizing that it needs to imagine what to do here. It's rehearsing its steps in imagination, working out what to do, until it finds in imagination a route that's going to work, and only then does it act on it. So it's much like the stepping stone case I was describing before. So perhaps we can appeal to affordances here too. So in the bodily case, the squirrel's acting on these affordances for climbing, for leaping, and so on. And then when it gets to the really difficult obstacle courses, the squirrel is acting on an imagination affordance. This current situation affords stopping and rehearsing your next steps in imagination. Okay, so we've covered 3 interesting varieties of affordance, and I've argued, perhaps a bit speculatively, that both humans and non-human animals are sensitive to affordances in all 3 categories. But once we've got these 3 categories, we can also speculate about how they might interact. So let's look at those combinations now. So I've introduced 3 categories of action, but these categories overlap. Okay. So if you think about these 3 categories here, there are such things as joint actions available to other people, mental actions for others, joint mental actions, and even joint mental actions for others. Do we perceive those affordances in the intersections of this Venn diagram? I'm going to suggest that we do. Okay, so these are quick and dirty examples, but they give you the idea. Do we perceive joint actions of others? Well, interestingly, in that study I described earlier, they did this study I described where you've got a participant going through the doorway with another person. But then they also ran the study again where the participant is watching 2 other people go through the door and has to predict whether the people are going to manage to fit through the door or not. And unsurprisingly, they were very good at doing it. We can explain this in terms of affordance perception. They were able to perceive a gap as walk-throughable by them, not walk-throughable by him or by her, but walk-throughable by them collectively. And maybe this is useful for animal perception as well. So imagine the wildebeest is walking through the wilderness and sees one wolf, right? It might think, I am not huntable by this wolf alone, right? It's not going to get me, I don't have to worry. Whereas when there's suddenly 6 wolves, it recognizes that it is huntable by those wolves together, and that's when you need to start running. Okay. But this is something that's too complicated for a wildebeest to think, so perhaps it's something that's literally built into their perception of the world. What about mental actions of others? So if I'm driving down the road and there's a car in front of me, as we approach a fork in the road, I can predict that the car in front of me is going to slow down. Why? Because I recognize that a fork in the road is likely to afford deliberation for that driver. And if you're deliberating, you tend to take your foot off the pedal and slow down a bit. So perhaps there I'm sensitive to this kind of third-person mental affordance. Now, I think it's, here's an example. This GIF has started in the wrong place, so you won't understand why I'm using it. Here's the relevant bit. A cat is sensitive to whether they are attendable by another animal. So when you see a cat doing this amazing kind of hunting behavior, they're so tuned in to whether they're going to be noticed by the other animal. That's such an important skill for a predator to have. And the cat is somehow sensitive to that. If it walks slowly enough and carefully enough, it won't be attendable by the other animal. And it knows that if, on the other hand, it meowed or it came more quickly, it would be attendable by the other animal. And here's a really bizarre example that I heard at a conference about 10 years ago. A study on fish that just sounds unbelievable, but I'm assured it's true. There are these interesting little fish known as cleaner fish. So on this big fish here, you might be able to see a couple of small fish. And what these fish do is they eat the dirt off larger fish. And larger fish will actually queue up to have the dirt eaten off them. It's like a car wash. But here's the interesting thing. The small fish don't actually eat dirt. They don't want dirt. What they want is little bits of skin tissue from the fish that they're cleaning. So every now and again, these cleaner fish will take a nip, right? They'll bite hard and get a little bit of skin tissue. But if they do it too much, then the big fish will go away and go somewhere else. Also, the other fish queuing up to be cleaned will go away as well, right? Because they've seen that these cleaner fish are biters. Now, here's the amazing observation. The cleaner fish will bite less when they're visible by other fish in the queue. When they're out of eye shot of the other fish in the queue, they will bite more. So they're in some way sensitive to whether they're attendable. Visible perhaps would be a better argument. I'm going to say attendable. Perhaps they're sensitive to whether they're attendable by the other fish in the queue. Now, these are pretty simple animals. They've got the tiniest brains you can imagine. That's a pretty sophisticated piece of behavior, and perhaps one we can again explain in terms of affordances. What about joint mental action? Maybe like the group of us can perceive a difficult problem as being calculable by us together, but not calculable by any of us alone. Joint attention is a rich topic of research, especially how young children learn to attend with others rather than just attending to the same thing as someone else. You attend together. Perhaps the child here perceives the star as affording joint attention. Now, it looks like for successful hunting behavior, maybe there's got to be some kind of perception of affordances for joint attention there as well. The wolf pack sees the wildebeest as affording attention by them together. Now, what about the big one? What about something that's in the intersection of all three of these things in the Venn diagram here? Now, this is getting really speculative, but how about this? Perhaps I can see things as being attendable by the crowd. So it affords the mental act of attending jointly by this group. So I see something happening on the pitch, and I can perceive it as attendable by the crowd. And perhaps the wildebeest can recognize that if they're standing in this position where they're very exposed, they are attendable by the pack. So it's a mental act it's a joint mental action by others to which they're sensitive. So I started off with two questions. What kinds of affordances do humans perceive? And what kind of affordances do non-human animals perceive? And understanding the answer to that question is going to help us understand just how widely this affordance-based explanatory framework can be used to explain actions. And my answer is, we can perceive loads of different types of affordances. We can perceive affordances not just in these three categories, but even in the intersections of these three categories. All right, I'd be very interested to hear which ones you think are plausible and which ones you don't. Thank you very much.